It is Washington Examiner Wednesday. Every Wednesday, we like to bring on one of our friends at the Examiner to talk about some of the key issues of the day. Thankfully, there's no shortage of things to talk about in the political climate that we've got going on right now. So today, on this Washington Examiner Wednesday, I'm pleased to welcome to the program breaking news reporter at the Examiner, Emily Larsen, joining us now. Emily, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Looking forward to this conversation because we're going to dive into some developments that have happened since a couple months ago when I published an op-ed in the Washington Examiner entitled "Beware the Push for Nationwide Vote by Mail Election." Just to tee it up for 1 second, I want to read a snippet of this piece that I had back in May, where I point out that on balance, vote by mail can be good when done right. Colorado, where I'm broadcasting from, for example, has held vote-by-mail elections where Republicans performed well and ones where Democrats did well. Compared to the national mood and voter registration numbers, the voting model doesn't really change outcomes. Additionally, election experts differ on whether in-person voting or vote-by-mail leads to more voter fraud. Yet even if vote-by-mail is generally positive, that doesn't mean 2020 is the year for nationwide expansion. I note that, as former Colorado Secretary of State Wayne Williams pointed out, it took the state a decade to get ready for vote-by-mail elections. Likewise for Oregon and Washington. Admittedly, those three states were pioneers and others would follow their lead, but the inherent complexities are inescapable. Emily Larsen, you've been reporting quite a bit extensively every couple of weeks on vote by mail, and this week you particularly had a piece talking about some of these challenges and potential delays. What are you noticing?
Well, I think the number one thing I'm noticing from people following this issue is that they're trying to stress that if the election, the presidential election in particular, is close in some of these swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Florida, if it's close, then the rise of vote by mail and mail-in absentee voting is going to mean that we're not going to have the results on election night as we have come to expect in previous cycles. It's going to look a lot more like the 2000 election than it is going to look like the 2016 election. And so and that's because there are inherent challenges in vastly expanding these vote by mail operations that states that don't already have a robust mail-in voting system need to hire people to process all of these ballots. There are likely to be lawsuits about which ballots are counted or not, whether ballots that are that arrive after election day should be counted. Legal issues can hold up these questions for months, or not months, but weeks, and or days. It might take days to actually count the ballots. And so that's what elections experts are trying to stress to the general public right now.
Yeah, I mean, we recall the 2000 election, and that one stretched out, like 36 days or so because it needed to go to the Supreme Court. Not only can you have counting delays, but imagine there are counting delays. Finally, all the ballots are counted a couple weeks in, and then the lawsuits start coming because there are some perceived irregularities happening, and maybe in some very pivotal states from the presidential election standpoint.
Yeah, certainly. And some of those, the hanging chads of 2000 might take a different shape in the 2020 election, and that will be whether the signature on the front of a ballot matches the signature for the voter on file, or whether the person selected too many candidates, whether the how they filled out the ballot was able to be read or not. Those are things that can be resolved when you vote in person at an in-person voting site, but are not going to be easy to fix if your ballot arrives on election day, and there are elections administrators that have to deal with that. So that will affect not only the presidential election, but all of the down ballot races as well. So especially in some of these congressional districts that are going to be very close, even in states that might not be close in the presidential election, that could affect the outcome of the control of Congress and also a lot of local officials as well.
As I've talked about on this program and discussed with election officials in Colorado, that signature verification, I mean, there's a lot involved because you need to get the database set up. You need to be able to verify from IDs and what have you, how to, whether or not these voters are actually legitimate eligible voters and so forth. And so there are a lot of these tricky situations. So the question is, how are new states that are just trying to bring this about in their areas, Emily Larsen, how are they doing that and handling this? Is it starting to pick up where they're actually putting into place these systems, or could we be getting to election day where suddenly everybody's like, wait a second, in our state, we're just not ready for this, or not election day per se, but even a month before when you start sending out ballots?
Well, they're trying to put them in place. California has already had a lot of mail-in voting for a long time, but it's certainly increased in the primary this year. And it took weeks to count those ballots. And so we can expect the same thing to happen to a lot of other states that are trying to expand their systems as well. But we're getting to the point now where it's a little bit too late to actually expand the system anymore at this point. The laws that are in place are going to be hard to change in order to have them actually implementable. So at this point now, it's all about how the elections administrators are going to be administering this, and whether the changes that have been made already are going to be are going to run smoothly on election day.
Yeah, and one other thing that is important, by the way, the legal hurdles are certainly significant in many of these states where you actually have to change the law or figure out workarounds in order to make these kinds of vote by mail systems function in a particular state. But not only that, and I've talked with our former Deputy Secretary of State, Suzanne Steyert, about this. One other thing that Colorado's experience shows is that there aren't enough ballot printers around the country as well. So if you end up having a lot more states involved in mail-in voting and they need the ballots, they could become sort of, remember earlier on in the coronavirus crisis, we were worried about having enough ventilators for hospitals. They could kind of be the new ventilators, at least for the COVID-19 era election.
Certainly, I've heard that ballot printing is an issue as well. There aren't enough companies with the capacity to print ballots for the increased demand that they're going to see. One of the things that some elections administrators and people who are really concerned about this are pushing is not focus on not only mail-in voting as a way to mitigate the risks of contracting the coronavirus at the polls, but also just to increase the time for voting. So instead of having an election day, you have more of an election week. You increase the number of hours that the polls are open in order to space out the people who can go to the polls. The challenge is, of course, getting that message to voters that they can vote early, and having enough elections administrators to man the polls at that time, because typically these elections administrators are older and in the type of area and the type of age group that is at risk when it comes to coronavirus.
Once again, we're talking with Emily Larsen, breaking news reporter with our partners at the Washington Examiner on this Washington Examiner Wednesday edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Let's stay on the topic of mail-in ballot, but more the politics of the thing. I mean, President Trump for weeks, months, has been railing against the idea of vote by mail. And you've had some interesting reporting about the potential political implications on Republican voters and turnout in those states that start really making the shift to vote by mail, and how President Trump's rhetoric could impact that. What are you finding?
Sure. So there's mounting evidence that President Trump's extreme opposition to vote by mail is really driving down Republican appetite for using the method at all. They think that it's going to be corrupt. They think that they want to make sure their ballots are counted. So there are a lot of valid concerns that they have, but it's the opposition to vote by mail among Republicans is going down, while Democrats are really wanting to use the method. And so the most recent evidence of this is CBS YouGov poll out of Florida and Texas. Well, in Florida, 59% of Biden voters said that they would want to vote by mail. That would be their preferred method, compared to 25% of Trump voters, which in itself, that's not necessarily bad unless you get to the point where you go to you're a Republican and you go to the polls on the election day, and it's not set up in a way to where it's easy to vote, and you have some voters on the margins or swing voters who decide that it's not worth their time to stand in line for hours, or it's too complicated to vote, and so they don't vote. And so that's the risk that Republicans run with demonizing vote by mail, especially President Trump keeping on this. Another important thing to keep in mind about that is, even as states are trying to expand vote by mail in a number of states, in the most important 6 swing states this year, they already have vote by mail. That was already, no excuse absentee voting was already in place in the 6 most important swing states. So this is going to be a challenge for Trump no matter what.
Thanks for watching this clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. You do not want to miss a minute of engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel, and you'll be sure to catch our live broadcast. I appreciate your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.
Awesome.